Joined by Robert Costa, one of my favorite guests of the week. He is, of course, with the Washington Post, my colleague at NBC. He's also the host of Washington Week in Review, the must-watch every Friday night show about what just happened and what's going to happen. Robert, I can't find the Twitter handle for Washington Week in Review. Is it quite simply Washington Week in Review?
It's just at Washington Week.
You know what? Someday I'll remember that. I remember that every time. How many followers does that Washington Week have? I'll bet you it has a lot.
Not enough. Needs more.
Okay, do you tweet it or does PBS tweet it?
PBS tweets it. I'm Costa Reports, but we're going to do more from Washington Week.
You should. It's a great brand, and you're perfect for it. So let me start where I left off with Josh Kraushaar last hour. The G7 Doral is not happening. The president has to find a place. My view is it ought to be Detroit or Cleveland. Highlight the Great Lakes. Highlight what America lost when it invested abroad in the Marshall Plan and rebuilding Japan. Highlight what it has done right in Lake Michigan and Lake Erie. Highlight what happens when infrastructure fails like Flint. What's the short list now? If it's not Detroit and Cleveland, what's on it, Robert Costa?
The short list for now is Camp David. There's a push to try to just keep this issue from exploding again, and the president was taken aback by how many Republicans were against the idea of doing it at Doral. And so when he spoke to moderate Republicans on the phone on Saturday who were at Camp David with Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief, he said, "Oh, Doral, it's a good spot. It's a good spot." And they reportedly told him, based on my conversations with White House officials, "Mr. President, we can't stand by this at all," and he pulled back.
That I knew. I'm just thinking Camp David was not such a great place the last time. It's not big enough. The press gets screwed. And if you're trying to show off America, it doesn't do you a lick of good. Why hold a summit in Washington, D.C.? It's like holding a summit in Paris. We're always more imaginative of that. Assume that it's not Camp David, and let me narrow it. Politically, if you were just thinking politically, if you're the political director of the White House, you go into the president and you say, these are the 3 states or 4 states where you ought to bring a lot of attention and money, what would be on that list?
Well, I think the South, based on my conversations with White House officials, needs more attention from Republicans. And you look at a place like Georgia, North Carolina, these places should be going Republican in 2020, but they have new demographics, new suburban voters trending in more centrist direction. So I could see paying attention to even a place like Texas, Georgia, North Carolina. It sounds obvious to go to the Midwest and to try to get those voters back. The Trump voter rallied again. But the South is going to maybe be more in play than people think.
Well, Georgia appeals because David Perdue, though he's going to win, could use some help. Tom Tillis could use some help, but the Republicans are going there to Charlotte. I mean, it could be a dry run for Charlotte. That's one good thing. But one thing Josh and I were talking about is Arizona, which I think is pretty secure, but Doug Ducey knows how to put on a show.
McSally's in a tough race.
Right. And so you put her and Doug Ducey next to each other at every international event, and it kind of helps, doesn't it?
It could be a powerful thing. And Iowa could be very important, too. The Democrats have been putting a lot of effort into there because they have a primary. And Senator Ernst is in a really, really tough race.
Now, that's interesting to me. I follow this pretty closely, and I rank the vulnerables as Cory Gardner and Martha McSally is the most vulnerable. After that, Tom Tillis. But I don't have Joni on that list because I study it pretty hard, and I think her personal story is compelling. And Iowans tend to stick with people, both left and right, through good times and bad, if they do their job. Is that not true about both Chuck Grassley? I'm trying to think about the Tom Harkin for a long time. Isn't it true they stick with people?
It's true, but Senator Ernst hasn't really been in office that long. She's tying herself to Chuck Grassley as much as she can politically. I was just with her in Iowa a couple weeks ago, and it was Chuck Grassley this, Chuck Grassley that. She knows his brand is strong. Her brand is strong. She has a compelling personal story, served her country in the military, has dealt with different personal issues in the past year that we know about. But at the same time, Iowa's becoming more liberal in the East, and they have a lot of ground Democrats doing a good job there building an infrastructure when Republicans are a little bit more idle.
Let's stay on Iowa for a second, and this is a real underhanded softball to Robert Costa, proud son of Notre Dame. Pete Buttigieg, every time he gets on air, impresses the living dickens out of me, though I disagree with him about a lot. I think he is the antithesis of Donald Trump in terms of approach and in terms of cool versus hot, and does very well on the small screen, where also Trump does very well on the small screen, but for different reasons. I think a lot of Democrats are afraid that because he's a gay married man, African Americans won't vote for him. I don't believe that's true, but it all will depend upon Iowa and New Hampshire. How is Mayor Pete, where there isn't a great African American demographic in terms of numbers, what do you think he's going to do in those two states?
It's hard to say exactly how he's going to do because right now he's rising in Iowa. The new Suffolk poll just reported this morning shows him rising to number 3 in Iowa, eclipsing Senator Sanders. So if he can come out of Iowa, especially if he can come out in top 2, Senator Warren, Buttigieg, if he can beat Biden and Sanders in Iowa, which looks possible at this point based on the numbers. He goes to New Hampshire, that's kind of a wash. That's Warren, Sanders territory geographically. Then he comes into South Carolina with some buzz, and he'd be someone who's not just a 4th Iowa candidate trying to salvage his campaign in South Carolina. He'd be maybe a top-tier candidate. And so maybe South Carolina doesn't matter as much as you head towards Super Tuesday. It becomes a 3 or 4 person race rather than a 2 or 3 person race. And so Buttigieg, this idea that South Carolina is the killer for his campaign because he can't win over African American voters, it's possible, but the dynamics of this race are so fluid that if he's strong coming out of Iowa, it's hard to see how he just somehow falls apart in South Carolina to the point where he quits the race.
Well, let's drill down into that Suffolk poll because it's news this morning. It's breaking news. Joe Biden, 18%, Elizabeth Warren, 17%, and Pete Buttigieg at 13%. Now, that is extraordinary for the mayor of South Bend, and it's because of his appeal. How do you summarize his appeal, Bob?
His appeal is generational and center-left. So he's one of the rare people, besides Beto O'Rourke and a few others, who are doing generational appeal. And he's taking some of Vice President Biden's positions on health care, kind of this public option view, the same as Senator Klobuchar, but he's framing it with this kind of passionate Democratic pitch that seems to have the passion of a Warren or Sanders candidacy, but it's not totally steeped in the politics of radical change. And so you have a candidate who's trying to appeal to almost the whole Democratic Party, plus he's a military veteran, bio-heavy. That's his whole package.
Now, it also, though, there's part of that package you didn't touch on, which is savvy about the environment in which we live, which is so ferociously and venom-filled partisanship that people are weary of. People from the left and the right, normal, ordinary people who don't mind a good political bar fight, they hate this. And I think he's kind of an antidote.
He is someone who projects calm. I've known him for many years. He is the opposite of President Trump temperamentally. He is someone who speaks in a totally different cadence. His challenge is going to be his rivals when they see him rising. They're going to try to paint him as Harvard, McKinsey, consultant. But he keeps trying to say in every debate, I'm Midwest, driving a Chevy, Midwest. As long as he can keep that Midwestern persona, who's a little bit more centrist but still left enough, he'll be in a real position to contend. But he has vulnerabilities because he's only in his late 30s, and he's now seen as a contender because of these new polls, and that makes him a target.
Now, tell me about you and him. Did you interview him when you were an undergrad? Was he on the political horizon there, or when did you first encounter Mayor Pete?
No, I first encountered him only about 4 or 5 years ago when he started to look toward running toward the DNC chairmanship race, and he was mayor of South Bend. I have known a lot of his friends and allies and advisors for years, just in being in the Notre Dame world. And he's not in the Notre Dame world. He's not a Notre Dame grad, but being the South Bend mayor, he knows a lot of people there. A lot of people work with him and respect him. And he's always just been someone who's been seen as a happy, engaging technocrat in that South Bend world who wanted to come home and help out his town. And he was good at selling himself to South Bend. I mean, he won by enormous margins in South Bend.
Quick question. There have been campaigns in American history like Clean Gene McCarthy and others where college campuses have got, John Anderson, 1980, have gone crazy for someone on college campuses. Do you think that's a Buttigieg possibility?
It is, though there's so much energy on college campuses now for democratic socialism and Senator Sanders and AOC and even Senator Warren. So the generational appeal is there, but he's not going to be the only college favorite.
But he is, when it comes down to it, the young face. I just think it would be fascinating. Robert Costa, as always, a pleasure. At Washington Week, if you want to follow. Bob Costa's brand. It's also Costa Reports. Follow me to the next segment, America. 1-800-520-1234. Matthew Elliott, the replay coming up as well here on the Hugh Hewitt Show.